to Rotted Reviews, and today I'm back behind the desk, and there's a reason for that. I'm actually not going to be doing a horror movie review today. In fact, what I'd like to do is something pretty different and take a step back, pull back just a little bit here, and discuss something in horror films that is very near and dear to my heart: found footage. I personally love found footage movies, but I also understand that a lot of you out there don't, and that's all right. Everybody has their own tastes, and everybody doesn't have to agree with one another. But it's one of the more common discussions that I find in the horror community, subreddits, forums, and so on and so forth. So I get it, but I do want to take the moment to potentially defend them and just basically say that I think that there's a place in the horror world for found footage. It's just that it's used way too often and not to great effect. And the thing of it is, I've been at this long enough and I've watched enough low budget, bad found footage horror movies out there that I think that I've been able to nail down several rules that would be a good template for filmmakers to abide by if they want to use found footage well. So please join me as we take a look at the 9 rotted laws of found footage. Now, before I begin, of these 9 rules, there's a lot of bleed through with one another, but there's also a big overarching theme, and that is, if you are attempting to use found footage as an inexpensive vehicle, you're already doing it wrong. If you think that having a GoPro strapped to your actors' heads is a sufficient enough method of filming that you can cobble it all together in the editing room and call it a day, you've already failed. Rule number 1, the camera is a character. This is something that has to be kept in mind at all times. That's the great thing about found footage, is it provides a level of dimension that isn't in typical movies. It's the kind of thing where we already have immersion because we're in the perspective. We are in the shoes of a character. We aren't watching from an ethereal place and, disembodied floating camera and so forth. We are there in the shit. But the thing to remember is the camera is a character, and the characters always have to be accounted for. If you are having a heartfelt scene just with 2 people alone, then they have to be coordinated with one another. If all of a sudden a third camera shows up to show both of them in frame at the same time, that doesn't work unless you're actually bringing another character in. The notion of having the camera somewhere needs to have a character accounted for it joining the camera perspective. If the character's not supposed to be there, then the camera shouldn't be there and an alternative should be found. I see this happen way too often where absolutely impossible footage is shot. And this may seem like picking nits, and in fact, a lot of the rest of the list might seem like picking nits, but it's a lot of small things that add up to a lot, and the one thing that you really need to do in found footage is keep the immersion. That is so key and critical, I can't possibly overstate it. The beauty of found footage is that we're with the characters, and by having that, we have immersion, and the immersion is what allows us to feel that fear with the characters. If the immersion breaks and the reality comes crashing down on us that we are not in the shoes of the character, but rather sitting in our comfy chairs watching a movie on a screen, that does nobody any good. The immersion is critical and it is key, and you always have to keep it. So this nitpicking actually serves a pretty big purpose. Rule number 2, reconsider your overlay. I can't stress this enough. It's another thing that could be picking nits, but it's so critically important. And what I'm talking about with reconsider your overlay is the crosshairs, or the framing squares, or the red blinky record light in the upper right hand corner. However you want to do it, the fact of the matter is the nature of found footage is a character is holding a camera. They are recording footage. They lose the camera. It is found later. Period. We are not recording the viewfinder of another camera, which is then pointed at the action. We are simply recording the action. So there's very often no reason to have any overlays whatsoever. And of course, there's a few exceptions to that. There's a few exceptions to all of these rules, such as CCTV footage, potentially old 80s VHS footage where people would often put time and date stamps and so forth for posterity and recording family memories, that kind of thing. Perfectly fine. In fact, that adds to the element. But if it doesn't fit, if it doesn't work, if it's not natural, if it shouldn't be on the screen by simply having found the footage, it shouldn't be there. Period. If you are fabricating an overlay for your film in the editing room, stop. Don't do it. I don't care if you're trying to show that you have switched cameras or that you are showing a different perspective, that somebody's holding a handheld instead of a GoPro, or you're moving to a fixed thing. Figure something else out. But don't artificially create an overlay. Always reconsider it. Rule number 3, hire a DP. Hire a director of photography, hire a cinematographer. Keep somebody in there that is setting the shots up, because that's important. Again, if you are simply trying to churn a movie out on the cheap and you think strapping a camera to the actors' heads or having them hold a cell phone is going to be a suitable alternative to actually having framed up shots, you are mistaken. How lighting is set up, how shadows work to effect, how your ISO is set, all of this needs to be planned, mapped out, storyboarded, and set up. It doesn't matter if the actors are actually holding the camera and talking with one another. It should be planned. It should be thought out ahead of time, and it should be purposeful to the intent of the scene. Number 4, and I really shouldn't need to say this, but I've seen it happen so often that I'm going to. Don't use music. Not to effect, at any rate. And what I mean by that is, if you're going to have music in a scene, fine, but have it going on a radio in the background, something along that line, where if it's actually happening in the scene itself. But too often I've seen moments where two characters are having a heartfelt heart-to-heart and emotional music starts swelling up out of the ether, and it's just, well, where the fuck is this coming from? If it doesn't physically belong in the scene, having a person just record it, then it shouldn't be in the movie. It's found footage, not found and edited for effect footage. That breaks the immersion. Don't put music or sound effects or jump scare harps, don't do it. Rule number 5, loose dialogue is fine, but don't improv everything. If you want to set up a scene with showing the actors generally where you want to land and letting them take their natural chemistry to that level, fine, but for the most part, everything should be scripted, and whether or not the actors deviate from the script and you allow them to freeform things a bit, well, that's up to you as a director how much you want to pull in those reins. But simply having nothing but storyboarded notes and general highlights doesn't cut it. You cannot count on the actors having their natural dialogue and natural conversations try to take over the movie. I've seen this way too often, where a group of teenagers are sitting around a campfire having the most awkward bullshit interaction with one another possible, and then after 5 or 6 boring minutes of that, one of them will all of a sudden say, "Hey, I sure do need to go to the bathroom out in the woods alone. I'll be back in a minute." Clearly that was just set up as set up the cameras, bullshit with one another, and then one of you get out of there. And that just doesn't cut it. That doesn't cut it for an interesting movie. Rule number 6, vary your different types of fear. This is something that I actually really should bring to the entirety of the horror genre, but it is especially important, I think, in found footage, because so often people trying to make movies on the cheap and relying on found footage as the only tool in their toolkit will only focus on jump scares. And I don't mind jump scares. I'm an advocate for them, and I'm actually probably going to make a separate video defending them at some point in the future. But that certainly shouldn't be the only weapon in your arsenal. You should be eliciting terror, dread, suspense, all manner of different atmospheric conditions that make the jump scares pop really well. It should not be your only method of fear delivery in your horror movie. It can be an extremely effective one, but only as one color in your palette. Number 7, always consider your information dissemination. This is a critically important thing, and again, it matters a lot in film in general, but the thing about found footage is it can do things as far as information dissemination that other movies can't. Really unique things that I think are a whole lot of fun and very playful. So what do I mean by all of this? Well, it's working with how much information you are providing to the audience, basically, and the playfulness comes into, well, we see what the character sees. More often than not, 99% of the time, found footage is the character is holding a camera. We see what they see, first-person perspective, so on and so forth. If something scary happens, at the same time we see it, they see it. So information is being processed on that level. But a lot of really good found footage will vary that up a little bit. It will have the actor turn the camera around and start speaking to their audience, that kind of thing. And then something's happening behind them. Now, all of a sudden, we have information that the character doesn't. This is a really great way to bleed into rule number 6 of varying the levels of fear and the types of fear, is by having this, we aren't necessarily working with jump scares, but we can start bringing some real dread, some real terror, and some real suspense because we aren't immediately reacting to the thing that's going on behind them, because we're not in their shoes. If the character is walking around like this and something scary pops out of the shadows, then all of a sudden the camera goes like this is because they're running and they're screaming and so on and so forth. That doesn't necessarily have to happen if we're switching things up, if we're doing this and having them talk to the camera. So it's a way of providing different levels of information to the audience, and that should always be something that you think of. How do you disseminate the information of the storyline, the scene, and the character to the audience, and how does that compare or contrast with the information that the character has? It's a fun little thing to play with, but it's an incredibly important part of storytelling. Number 8, consider your chain of custody. This is something that I don't think is actually a really hard and fast rule, but I have to say, with all my experience, there is a very strong correlation between movies that actually try to go and explain the chain of custody and the quality of those movies, and they're often very well paralleled. See, the notion is we're watching found footage movies, so somebody found it, and now we're watching it. What happened between those 2 points? That's actually something that you don't have to provide, but I think it really works to some great effect. Movies like Grave Encounters or Noroi the Curse, which is set up as a documentary style. It's the kind of thing where you could have a very quick scene in the beginning where a journalist is talking to the camera interview style and talking about how this tape showed up on their doorstep in a blank manila envelope with no return address, anything like that. And they've been trying to track down who it is. And then it can have an interview with a private investigator who tried to track it down. And then basically saying, here's the accounts of what happened. We're not going to edit this footage. We're going to show you exactly what we got. Again, it doesn't have to be there, but I just noticed a very strong correlation between very good quality found footage horror movies and the explanation they provide in that chain of custody. And then you can have some great movies like Hill House LLC that take that and actually turn it on its head and incorporate it into the story as part of the final elements. I just think it really brings it to life a whole lot more. And again, it's all about immersion. So yeah, I think that that's an important rule, even if it's not a really hard and fast one. Number 9, and the last rule, don't forget to have a story. Art and the art of cinema is designed to do one major thing, and that is elicit an emotion from us. And one of the best ways it can do it, one of the most effective and most popular ways, is through storytelling. Movies are a visual storytelling device. And a concept is not a story. A story involves conflict. It involves characters overcoming that conflict. It involves characters growing. There's a whole lot involved in a good story. And that is the foundational elements of any movie, including found footage. I see it way too often where somebody will have a concept of a swamp monster. They will put some teenagers going out hiking and camping next to the swamp, and then that's all they really rely on. There's no story to be had. It's simply a cheap method of filming a concept, relying on jump scares. Again, this all kind of bleeds together, and then doing it ham-fistedly, expecting that to work in the editing room, and they've, boom, made a movie for $5,000. It doesn't work that way. Yes, you can make found footage on the cheap, but these are some principal rules that are good to adhere to, or at the very least consider. You should always respect your format, and respect your perspective. And in doing so, you're also going to do something that's pretty critically important for any movie, is respect your audience. So I think that should about wrap this one up. I really thank you for joining me here on this video. I look forward to seeing you on my next one. Remember, next time you want to watch a horror movie, first make sure that it's good and rotted.